All right. Thank you all for joining in. We are in the last panel of the day. It's a very important panel. It's a panel that discusses something that we all think about as researchers. It's about gender and genocide. And how we think about this is important, is that gender plays an important role in not only thinking about the genocide, but how we think about genocide as a crime and preventing it as we move forward, especially in societies where increasingly we see not only state but authoritarian violence, but also collective public violence. And today we have two wonderful speakers, both of them who've done work within genocide prevention, who will talk to us about both of these issues, but also help us think through how we understand the crime of genocide beyond just sexual violence. And I think it's very important to understand those concepts as well. The way we are structuring today's conversation is that I'm going to introduce both of our brilliant panelists today, and then allow for both of them to make their opening introductory remarks, following which I have some questions that I will be putting to them. And I'm also hoping to open up this conversation to an audience question the last 20 minutes. So it gives the audience time to think through, but also put some questions to them. This is going to be a fireside chat, so we really want to try and make sure that the conversation is accessible. And we also want to make sure that if you have any questions, especially about questions about genocide, how does one define genocide? How does one think about gender? Feel free to put all those questions so that we can have that conversation. I'm going to begin by introducing two of our panelists today. We have Elisa von Jordan, who's the endowed chair of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Keene State Universities. Before that, she served as the Dr. Marcia Radikoff Grossman Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies. She has a BA from Columbia University and a PhD in history from the University of Pennsylvania. And she teaches research practices on genocide prevention, gender, genocide, comparative genocide, and Holocaust, sexualized violence, imperialism, race, and war. Belma Saric is a Bosnian journalist and the founder and president of the Post-Conflict Research Center, a peace-building organization based in Sarajevo, which works to cultivate an environment of sustainable peace in Bosnia and the greater Balkan regions. As a trained researcher, journalist, and human rights defender, she's dedicated a career to investigative reporting and peace building in the Balkans. Together, I want once again invite both of our panelists. And Elisa, would you like to go first and then have your opening remarks, and then we will come to Belma?
Certainly. Thank you so much, Suchitra, for that beautiful introduction, for that very kind introduction. I'm very honored to be here with my two really esteemed co-panelists who I've not had a chance to meet in person, and with whose paths have not crossed with mine, and whose paths I have not crossed with in all of the work that I've done, which has been a frustration. So I know about both of you. So I'm so happy that this conference was able to bring us together. And I'm very, very honored as well to be a part of this very important conference on India on the brink. So thank you very much for making this possible. And I'm looking forward to this hour. I just have a few opening comments, sort of framing points that perhaps we can get into if folks are interested in the next hour. And the first one is that we cannot prevent genocide without women. And I think this still needs to be said. And this means that we have to include women at every level of the prevention apparatus, which certainly has not happened yet, but also that we must consider and take seriously women's experiences during genocide, but also during quote unquote peacetime, and the insights that these experiences lend to genocidal processes. So women's experiences, and I think we'll talk about this a bit, open up and kind of shift the way we look at genocide and genocidal processes, and this has not been fully recognized or accepted within the genocide prevention community. The second point I want to make is when we include women's experiences in our prevention mechanisms, we begin to see many new and important trajectories that act as indicators and red flags of genocide before a genocidal process has started, as well as in the initial stages when it is forming. So women's experiences are critical to our ability to see genocide. And there is a direct relationship, and this has been shown time and again, between the levels of gender inequality in societies and their propensity for internal and external conflict. And this gender inequality can include formal policies of inequality, but it can also include widespread and unaddressed violence against women, such as a prevalent rape culture, which we have in, for example, the United States. So in saying this, usually what happens is that when we talk about women's inequality, suddenly the focus goes to countries in the global South. And this is absolutely incorrect, right? Women face inequality in the global North as well, maybe not so much formalized inequality, but society-wide inequality, like prevalent, very violent forms of rape culture. So I just want to point that out, that we have to look at genocide prevention horizontally that way and equally across cultures. And maybe this is something we can discuss later in our fireside chat. My third point is that, but as having said this about women, gender, of course, as a category and as a performed reality, includes men as well as women. So it's not just about women. Gender analysis includes men as gendered subjects, so men and masculinity as they experience their identities as men and as gendered subjects, as well as everyone in between and outside of this false gender binary, right, which we know now is no more than an ideology of gender that's laid on a very, very complex biological and social reality of gender. So this means that when we are using a gendered lens for prevention, we are looking at a lot of things. We're looking at gender dynamics, gender performances, the organization of gender within families and communities and nations. We're looking at gendered atrocities and gendered speech acts, and not just at women. We're looking at the bodies and the realities of people of all genders, including men who are not agender. They're not the sort of neutral historical subject. They are gendered people as well. My fourth point, and it has to do with a panel, an excellent panel that I moderated yesterday on the hijab ban, hate speech, and hounding, targeting of Muslim women in the long shadow of Gujarat in 2002, which I highly suggest people go back and watch. It was an excellent and very probing panel. And the discussion there really demonstrated how women's bodies can become the sites of genocidal initiatives well before there is mass killing. So we have a tendency in genocide studies and in prevention to view genocide as mass killing, really as a synonym for mass killing or mass violence. But genocide, it's a crime of intent, and it doesn't always take on mass characteristics, and it can look individualized, and it can look stochastic, right? A new word that's being used, as it's forming, as it's percolating. And those little individualized acts can be microcosms of genocide. So in India today, efforts to ban the hijab in schools, combined with apps that purport to sell Muslim women who have spoken out against discrimination and persecution, and other forms of very violent symbolic violence, hold within them, and this is what came out of yesterday's panel, the same logic that was expressed on women's bodies during the Gujarat genocide in 2002. And and I'm specifically speaking here of things I've called in my own work life force atrocities, which are atrocities that are aimed at harming whatever the perpetrator believes biologically, culturally, socially, and politically and historically reproduces a group. So this includes not only physical violence against bodies, but very symbolic violence against relationships and symbols. And in Gujarat was characterized by horrific violence against Muslim women, including the evisceration of pregnant women, which is very, very highly correlated with genocidal practice, the killing of babies, the killing of children in front of their mothers, gang rape in particularly humiliating ways, the inserting of objects into women's bodies. All of these symbolic and visceral and physical forms of violence really are crystallizations of intent to destroy the life force of a group in its larger formation, its larger understanding in the minds of perpetrators. And so these are, in my estimation, signs of intent and examples of how taking women seriously, right? Taking women's suffering seriously can help us see genocide before it takes on its mass murder dimension, which is to point out, right, this close connection between feminicide, if we want to call it that, right, and misogyny on the one hand, and genocide on the other. And that brings me to my my fifth point, which is that all of this raises questions about how we define genocide, the definition of genocide, which I think even in its legal formulation in the Genocide Convention is more gendered than we recognize, because Raphael Lemkin himself saw things in a very gendered way, or was sensitive to gender and gendered violence. But that gender script has been written out of the Genocide Convention and now almost no longer exists within courts of law, although there are important court cases that have recognized it. So definition of genocide changes when you take women into consideration, as does how we approach genocide in a legal sense, right, in the courts, what we count as genocidal crimes during the process of genocide, and then how we approach healing, right, and social reconciliation after genocide. So I think this gender dimension is incredibly important, if not central, in our efforts to prevent genocide. And we may not get very far, as we have not, when we do not include them. And genocide to end is much more than mass murder, right? And we are still learning a great deal about the crime. We don't know everything about this crime. And one of the reasons we're still learning, and there's still so much to learn, is that because we are only very recently taking the voices of women seriously. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elisa. A lot to think about and unpack. Velma, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much. I would also like to express my gratitude for being a part of such an important conference, probably in a really important time, also having in mind what's going on currently in Ukraine. And probably you do have some knowledge that I'm coming from the country where the latest genocide took place, which is Bosnia and Herzegovina, when in July 1995, more than 8,000 Muslim men and boys were systematically killed in the course of only a few days. And then they have been thrown in the mass graves, and then second genocide took place when they actually tried to relocate their bodies from primary to secondary mass graves. I'm going to speak a little bit, and I want to say that it's extremely important also to mention that rape and sexual violence was used as a tool of genocide in the latest Bosnian war. According to United Nations data, between 20 and 50,000 women in Bosnia went through rape and sexual violence. And we need to remind here, and we need to actually say that through the braveness of Bosnian women, rural Bosnian women from Eastern Bosnia, who took a stand in the front of the International Tribunal for former Yugoslavia in the case of Kunarac, rape became crime against humanity. And this is something what rural Bosnian women were able to contribute through their braveness to stand on the trial and go through this painful process. Also, it's probably through history of my country and everything what I'm witnessing after genocide, because I've been doing this work and I'm more practitioner than scholar, but I'm doing this work probably now for 23 years. We did so how important the role of women is in post-conflict or post-genocide period, where we did witness the braveness of women again from Bosnia, especially mothers of Srebrenica, who were after genocide in 1995, were systematically pushing and looking for their beloved ones who actually were missing during that time. That is the reason why International Commission of Missing People, ICMP, was established. And through the first DNA method also being discovered through Srebrenica genocide, unfortunately, now we are witnessing that ICMP, or International Commission of Missing People, is an international organization being based in Hague, in Netherlands, and searching for missing people through all around the world. And this is also a contribution which actually was done by these rural women who did organize themselves on 1995 into women movements. And, you know, we are talking about the rural women who were mostly laying on the support of their men who suddenly were missing, they've been killed, and their braveness and their heroism to actually establish these movements and seek for justice and pursue for justice, it's incredible. Currently, we are facing the last phase of genocide, which our dear professor and mentor Gregory Stanton was establishing, which is genocide denial. But also in Bosnia and the region of Western Balkans, we have a new, I would say, new step, which is glorification and rehabilitation of war criminals. And we are facing a large number of young people, youth, unfortunately, who are followers of these politics, and they are participating and they are systematically being part of the campaign of genocide denial. All this recently brought the law being actually pushed by the international community and the High Representative in Bosnia. And this law, according to some nationalistic politicians, is bringing the new, a large crisis which we are facing in Bosnia right now and the region of Western Balkan, political crisis, where the entity which did commit a genocide in 1995, Republika Srpska, is trying to proclaim independence. So with all these issues and with all these problems we are facing in our country, it's really difficult to even speak about youth education and peace building education, which we are primarily doing in Post-Conflict Research Center, because we have been really worried about the new generations. In a country with 186 ministries, but no state ministry for education or for youth policies, or not in a country where you are not able, if you're a peace builder or if you're a civil society, an NGO organization working in this field, you are not able to go to school in a country where we have this pure phenomenon of segregation, 2 schools under one roof. According to OSCE reports, we still have 56 schools in Bosnia where kids are literally separated to, they go into the same school in the same building, but they are separated and they don't even have a chance to interact between each other during the school breaks. So you can imagine how difficult it is to actually do a peace building work and to work on the prevention, to work on especially genocide prevention. And what we did, and I'm going to mention just briefly and then I will stop, what we did trying to work on prevention of genocide and education parallelly is through a set of multimedia educational programs, which we were combining with the legacy of International Tribunal for Former Yugoslavia, trying to create programs which will be more interesting and more interactive and more attractive to youth, through the use of social media and art and digital media, film and for example, photography. And we also did parallelly work with the United Nations Office of Special Advisor for Genocide Prevention, where we were bringing the office to educate civil society into the mechanisms of genocide prevention and mass atrocities, learning about frame, but also making connection between the office and the civil society in the Western Balkans. On 2017, we did establish first coalition for genocide prevention in the Western Balkans, consisting 35 leading civil society organizations. And the whole idea behind coalition is actually to work on genocide prevention, to create synergy among civil society, to create a joint action plan. And during this recent crisis we had in our country and the region, our coalition was actually stepping very bravely, and we did send a bunch of letters through all around the world, urging on necessity to preserve peace, trying to mobilize international community, civil society, academic community, but also our diaspora to react, to act, and to try to protect the integrity and independence of our country. So I stop here and leave more floor for.
Thank you so much for that. Elisa, I'm going to start with you. You spoke about how prevention is almost impossible without women. And you also spoke about this as a lens to come up with indicators that can think about the prevention. Can you talk to us a little bit more about this in the context of India as well? What do you see right now are ways for us to think about the idea of prevention without women, but also within the context of the red flags that you're seeing in India right now?
Okay, yeah, so prevention requiring women. I think one of the reasons this is necessary, and of course, one doesn't speak just of any women, right? You made a comment, a wonderful comment to the panelists about women perpetrators. And when we talk about gender, there are these very gendered normative assumptions often that men are perpetrators and that women are victims. And in the history of genocide, men have been the architects of genocide more often than women, although women have sometimes been included in those circles. So we don't know if there, what would happen if there would be sort of equality between the sexes, or an abolition of gender through some sort of organic historical, development in the world. Or if we would have many genders, or an exception that everybody's everyone's fluid and somewhere along this spectrum. So we don't know how genocide would look, whether it would still be perpetrated, who knows. But what we do know is that it's a highly masculinist crime in which women often participate as perpetrators, both as helpers, as partners, and as direct killers, and as motivators, right? And as kind of forceful advocates for genocide. So we do see that, and we have seen that. I have watched some of the clips on YouTube about speeches that are given, genocidal speeches being given by extremist Hindu nationalists in India, and many of them are women. And the things they are saying are profoundly genocidal and violent. So when we're talking about having women at the table, right? This means women who are working just as men against genocide. We need experts, we need survivors, we need members of civil society, practitioners, right? And women, of course, do not have a singular identity or approach to the world, but we need that variety, right? And of course, across all sort of identity groups and regional forces and sort of the geographies that we all, of power in which we all live. So it would be the inclusion of women is part of diversifying or decolonializing, right? Genocide prevention. So I have to say that at first, right? I'm not suggesting a kind of essentialized approach to women as peacemakers. We just have not seen that. However, because women, having said all of that, because women in the world frequently have the responsibility for family care in a direct way, that does actually bring to the table, right, certain insights that are lacking otherwise. And so in peace building, if you just have men at the table, if you just have the former leaders of armed forces at the political and military leaders of armed forces at the table, you miss out on that entire dimension of the world that also requires peace and may not experience peace if they're not at the table. So for example, after war and genocide, violence against women tends to become worse. Family violence, domestic violence tends to rise. Violence against children tends to rise. And so what can happen is that there's a peace in the formal sphere, right, or in the public sphere, and no peace, right, in well, I don't want to call it the domestic sphere, but since we're often caught in these binaries, right, in the sphere in which women live. So that is my call for including women, right, in prevention apparatuses. And this is really important. There are prevention organizations out there that have no women in their organizations, on their boards, or in their administration, right? So there are still all male institutes doing genocide prevention out there, and they're missing out on, the nuanced perspectives that women and feminists can bring. So that needs to change, I think. And in terms of talking about long-term genocide prevention, this means that women also play an incredibly important role in the lead up to genocide, either as people speaking for perpetration or as people speaking for peace. And in many societies, women have lateral ties that men lack, right? So and a way of thinking about prevention is thinking about, and this is something Velma was just talking about, how do you create synergies between, within civil society, both internationally and more locally. And women sometimes, and this has been true in Rwanda, for example, have institutions that get overlooked, right? They're sometimes less formal than the official male institutions, but they're very important, and they can be very important to harness for peace building. Furthermore, women can use there's all sorts of language of family care, right, and of responsibilities, social responsibilities that women can bring to the table in terms of peace. We've seen from studies of genocide and genocidal processes and the decisions that are made by families and communities as they're facing genocide, that women, because their identities are formed by so much more than simply their public persona, they often have very creative approaches to finding safety. They are more willing to leave. They are more willing to flee and try to rebuild somewhere else. And sometimes they are more able to do so. So we see that in Ukraine now, where men between 18 and 60 are not able to leave. They can't leave, right? So if we leave women out of the agenda, we also deprive potential victim communities of important creative tools that they can use to try and at least protect some if genocide is inevitable and there seems to be no way to prevent its worst articulations, right? So there are many ways in which we could talk about this, and it's incredibly complicated. But what I would say that needs to happen in India is that there, and I see this happening already, but I think women providing real allyship, right? Hindu women, Christian women, other women providing real allyship to Muslim women whose bodies are now really the focus of genocidal language is very important. And not to get bogged down, this became yesterday very clear in the panel I moderated, not to get bogged down in the question of the hijab and whether it's, whether it's coerced or voluntary. This is sort of a blaming the victim, right? So to have no conditional allyship, to simply stand next to, in every way that you can, right, in every way that Hindu women can, to stand next to Muslim women and other women who are facing this kind of barrage of genocidal practice. Stand next to and support, right? And take a secondary role and do what is necessary, right, to protect. So women in perpetrator societies can have a really important protective function. Of course, then they become also the targets of genocidal language, right? And so they have to prepare for that. Furthermore, there needs to be a sort of, maybe globally, and I think this would help for India, a sort of global recognition of how masculinity can be, how masculinity can become instrumentalized as genocidal masculinity, and how in almost all cultures in the world, men and masculinity, right, or women and men can draw on certain tropes within masculinity to justify and legitimate violence and make it seem exciting and encourage people to participate. So there's something really deeply pleasing to human beings about genocidal masculinity. And we saw in the Holocaust, for example, studies of, if you've read Wendy Lauer's Hitler's Furies, right? She shows how women were also felt that genocidal masculinity expressed by German men, the SS, the Wehrmacht, right? German police forces, also encouraged women to see themselves as free and liberated. So they saw this as a source or a vehicle for their own liberation, and would sometimes go out of their way to prove that they too can be killers, or participate in the killing machine. So genocidal masculinity is profoundly, unfortunately, very profoundly, it seems very profoundly attractive to our species. And women can speak against it in a very particular way, because almost all of us have been victims of toxic masculinity in one way or another, or are survivors of it, or who live and have learned to adapt to toxic masculinity in our lives. And there's a very direct relationship that we have then to genocidal violence. I point out to my students all the time, and I think it's a very incredibly important that we all recognize this, that the crimes that are committed against women in genocide, such as rape, right, are also crimes that are committed in peacetime all the time. They're the very few, right? Very few crimes committed in genocide are committed in the same way during peacetime. And one of them is rape. Very cruel forms of rape. We see that in peacetime constantly. And so we could speak to that. We have our own experience, right, with quasi genocidal violence. There are even some scholars of rape who talk about rape as a genocide against individual women, because the goal is to destroy her womanhood, to destroy her identity as such through this violence of rape. So none of us in the world are unfamiliar with what becomes generalized during genocide. And I think we have a very, very powerful voice because of that as a collective, given all of our differences.
Thank you for that. Welma, the question that I have for you is, the work that you do is with educating. You talked about educating a generation about what happened. But we're also living in a time where, even when I used to work with the tribunal, already new versions of history was being written. Often the people that I would encounter would say, no, this never happened. Just as you had people who denied the Holocaust, you also had people who denied that what happened in Srebrenica. Now, the same thing is kind of, I see, repeating in societies like India as well, is that even though you have proof of, say, violence or war crimes or genocide that happens, people still don't believe in it. So how does one educate in circumstances, especially today with so much disinformation and misinformation? Would love to hear from you about that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Actually, that is exactly what we are dealing in the region of Western Balkan, but as you mentioned, through all around the world. I mean, what we are trying to do, and for us, probably the International Tribunal for Former Yugoslavia is the biggest achievement, and only for now historical record, which we can incorporate, as I mentioned, in our educational curriculums. But what definitely we do through incorporating materials from survivors and the victims in the work is also developing empathy among youth, among young people, among general public. And what we did see through our experience is that the use of film, for example, documentary film, but it can be even feature film, but documentary mostly, and also photography can be, which is in reality art, can be a really incredible, strong tool for developing empathy and also allowing young people to create their own opinion, which will not be based on what they learned through family narratives, which unfortunately are conflicting in my country and generally when we have a genocide and Holocaust denial. But also we do have a systematic campaign run by entity Republika Srpska who committed genocide, their politicians, a systematic campaign which is trying to re-question and reconsider the legacy of International Tribunal for Former Yugoslavia by recently establishing two a quasi-commission or commissions combining from a quasi-experts through the world, which would examine again the genocide in Srebrenica and the siege of Sarajevo. Unfortunately, the Israeli historian in this case, Gidon Grif was also involved in these commissions, and he recently published reports where he was claiming that instead of 8,500 men and boys, Muslim men and boys, was actually 3,500. So when you have all this machinery, and I'm mentioning this, when you have all this machinery which is working push the genocide denial and to rewrite the history, it's really difficult. So what we do, it's really difficult actually to educate the youth. So what we do, beside the use of film and photography, which is art, and who is interested for this more, we did work closely with the King's College in the latest 4 year, where they were evaluating our work, and they were evaluating how we actually are using art as a tool for reconciliation. I can share some of these reports and evaluations they did. But what we also are trying to do is to teach young people, teach youth through basic citizenship, journalistic training, to look for their own information. So what we do this through a 7 days long training given by professional journalists and also photographers who do teach them a basic skills of documentary photography. And then we send them back, when we equip them with this basic knowledge that they can report from their communities, we send them back to their communities, and we continue to work with them through mentorship program. So they are also working and looking for their own stories of their communities. And mostly with this, when I mentioned empathy in the beginning, we did this by raising the stories of moral courage and rescue behavior. We were looking into those stories of people who, during the war and genocide in Bosnia, were crossing the ethnic lines, and they were trying to protect sometimes people they do know, like friends and neighbors, but sometimes people they didn't even know. And we did find these stories in every ethnic and religious community. Bosnia is also a multi-ethnic country. We have Christians and Muslims and Orthodox and Jews. We also have people which unfortunately are classified as others. Those are people as Roma communities and mixed marriages. So it's a very, really difficult actually to have a balance and provide space for everybody, but that is exactly what we are trying to do. We are always looking to put the platform and say stories of every ethnic and every religious group, including minorities, and trying to kind of create the counter narratives, those narratives which will actually raise hope and optimism. And through some facts, like judiciary facts, actually allow young people to start to think out of the box and everything what is unfortunately our environment.
Thank you for that. We have a lot of audience questions, so let's get to that. We have a question from Dina Siddiqui, who asks, could you elaborate on the connections between femicide and genocide? Elisa, I think this is for you.
Yes, thank you for that question. The most important connection is in intent, right? So femicide, when it was developed as a term or a concept in the 1970s, it was developed in the Anglo world, and it meant in English, right, simply the sort of killing of women by men. But when it entered the Spanish literature, particularly in Latin America, it was translated as feminicide, which is in fact perhaps a better term to capture social realities in Latin America, and has made me think deeply about what we mean by femicide. So in feminicide, the idea is that this is not just killing, and it's not simply about killing individual women, but killing off sort of the feminine part of the world. So that in each woman's body, right, the perpetrators of this violence are seeing womanhood, or seeing what they imagine to be that sector of the world. And so there's a kind of genocidal dynamic within the misogyny expressed in feminicide. I've seen this approach to feminicide used very well as additionally in analyses of transgender women who tend to be killed at very high rates, but in individual ways. So again, we go back to this stochastic pattern where you have smaller microcosms, but the sort of violence that is done against transgender women's bodies in their in these microcosms is very genocidal and seems to speak to an intent to erase transgender identity, or especially transgender feminine identity as such. And so within that as well, you have a kind of genocidal intent. So the link between feminicide and genocide, I don't see it so much in terms of the law or the legal definition of genocide, but in terms of the process of an articulation and an implementation of genocidal intent. And then the question becomes, can individuals commit genocide against other individuals? Or, maybe an even better question is that is framing these sorts of violences within a logic of genocide, is that helpful? Does that help us see things that can help us reduce them, right? Feminicide, genocidal violence against transgender women, right? And then later genocide. And so, it's about looking at these microcosms and understanding that sometimes genocidal dynamics occur in very small ways. And I want to say, if anyone's interested in the work on transgender women, you can look for Haley Marie Brown. She was a former student of mine and is a beautiful scholar working on, she does beautiful work on this. So I just wanted to call out her name. So that would be my answer to that. I don't know if Velma and Suchitra want to talk a little bit about that as well.
Velma, would you like to talk about the relationship between feminicide and genocide, or should we go to the next question? Velma, we have a couple of questions for you. The first is from Anisha. She's asking if there is a similar program or initiatives in place for genocide prevention and media projects in relationship to India, either something that you know of or something that your organization works on.
Unfortunately, not for India, but what I know is that United Nations Office for Genocide Prevention, actually the Office of Special Advisor for Genocide Prevention and Responsibility to Protect, they do have a possibility to replicate the program which we actually organize in the region of Western Balkan, which is the utilizing of civil society and learning about the mechanisms of genocide prevention, also the inhibitors of crimes, which is really important. On another hand, it's giving an opportunity to civil society to work closer with the UN office in the case of emergency, in the case of that they need to report a certain crisis in the region or in the country, which actually have been really useful for civil societies from the region of Western Balkans. This connection between office and them, that they can directly report their concerns or problems or issues, was really, really also useful. What definitely can be replicated and what is always, I think, the best way to fight genocide denial and all these, consequences which we are dealing currently here in Western Balkans, but also globally, is to take a look the power of social media. The social media definitely, if we are following right now the war in Ukraine and everything what is going on, is giving us enormous opportunity to connect between each other, to learn from each other, to share expertise. And the programs which we did create, which I mentioned, the citizenship journalism program, which now we are targeting only the youth, and we are working with the young people, can be replicated on ordinary people. And and everybody now have a mobile phone, everybody now have an internet connection, and this is something what can be a really, really great and free tool to fight and to actually react and connect, and to connectivity. At least what we saw through our Genocide Prevention Coalition, which I mentioned previously, working closely with civil society, trying to support each other, trying to have a synergy among us, and then also act as a watchdog of government and push more for the certain changes we would like to see. I definitely recommend a better connectivity and better synergy among civil society. And that is something what can always be replicable through the world.
Oh, Suchitra, we can't hear you. You're muted.
I'm so sorry. 2 years into the pandemic, we're still doing IM. My apologies. So we also have a follow-up question where it's for Velma. It says, also, could you explain about the segregation in the buildings in the schools that you mentioned? Is that because of the policy or based on mutual distrust and hostility between the communities? Velma, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Sorry, it was completely.
No worries. So we had a follow-up question about, you mentioned about the segregation in the school buildings. So one of our audience members is asking can you explain about the segregation in the buildings in the school that you mentioned? Is that because of policy or based on mutual distrust and hostility in the communities?
That is because of policy, unfortunately. When the war was stopped, it was stopped through Dayton Agreement, which was peace accord for Bosnia and Herzegovina. Unfortunately, peace accord or Dayton Agreement, which was signed in Dayton in Ohio in the United States, that is why I have a name Dayton, was just temporary solution for BIH. It wasn't permanent, never. But unfortunately, our nationalistic politicians, they would like to keep the Dayton Agreement as the base for segregating. And the kids now in these 56 schools, they are like literally, they do go into the same building, but they are completely separated. For example, Muslim kids, they go into the left or Orthodox, they go right. And they do learn different curriculums regarding the language. They do learn different curriculums regarding the recent history. And we do have a religion also being involved into this subject of religion, which have been taught in schools. So all this is actually something what is creating more division among youth, because schools should not be a playground for nationalistic politicians to keep their agendas going on. But I mean, since we have still nationalistic politicians on power, they don't want to even discuss the reform of education. We don't even have an idea how our education will be reformed. We are not even working. I mentioned in a country with 186 ministries, and just to make sure our country is really small, we have 3.5 million people living. So it's a really small country. We have 186 ministries. I think Switzerland have 8, and they were discussing to cut on 6. So you can imagine the bureaucracy, administration, and how expensive it costs to have these politicians on power. So unfortunately, yeah, that is a result of politics.
So this is the next question. It's for both of you. Perhaps Elisa, you can take it first. What strategies can be used to educate masses who are swayed by hateful ideologies and are easily convinced to commit crimes against humanity? I'll put this question to both of you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really important, that's the key question in a sense in long-term prevention. I co-founded and I'm co-president of a genocide prevention organization called the Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention. And our approach to that question is to fill a void in our international prevention mechanisms. There is a lot of training in genocide prevention for elites, for the elite strata of the world, government officials, military officials, for example, and very little for the global grassroots. Although in the end, it's us in the global grassroots who are going to be called upon to commit genocide and become the foot soldiers for genocide. So we do training. We are now developing, and it should be out next month, an online course that sort of brings this elite level training, which we've been involved in, down to the grassroots. It's like a boot camp, but, you know, people can do it. You can do it at your own time. And it trains people in genocide prevention. And I think one of the most important things we can do is simply speak to the global grassroots about genocide prevention. We did this work in person before the pandemic in Iraq, which is a country that is just caught in cycles of genocide. And there was so much interest and so much embracing of the possibility of simply training large groups of people within a society to commit to not commit to genocide against one another, and to understand. I think sometimes people get swayed by ideologies and they don't understand the implications of what they're doing. It may be hateful and they see that and they like that, they want to hate, but they don't really understand where they're headed. And training even people who subscribe to hateful ideologies in genocide prevention, training people who have already taken up arms in genocide prevention at the lower levels, right, of society. So civil society, but especially the grassroots, can be incredibly powerful. And in Iraq, what we tried to do was to get people from different communities that are often at loggerheads together, so that they could create a shared language of genocide prevention. And as Velma pointed out, develop their own narratives of truth and develop their own narratives of the future, and commit themselves and find buy-in in their own communities to this shared agenda of prevention. So I think that's one of the most important things we can do, is simply put genocide prevention on the agenda for all of our social movements, for education, formal education, but particularly for informal education of the global grassroots, including ourselves. Thanks.
Velma, would you like to answer that question as well?
I completely agree with everything what Elsa just mentioned. Exactly, prevention should be in the focus, and it should start it on the grassroots and then, you know, go on the top. We had some here in the Western Balkans, some try of establishing the commissions for reconciliation, and they didn't work because unfortunately we were not using the down top approach. It was vice versa. But I also do know through our experience is that, for example, we work closely with State Memorial, Srebrenica Genocide Memorial, which is the only state institution in the country, being also established with a special decision of High Representative, which is international community. Also through the bravery of Bosnian women who were pushing Srebrenica mothers, we're really pushing to have a cemetery and memorial on the last place where they are beloved ones were, which is Srebrenica, the Dutch UN base in Potocari. So we work closely with Srebrenica Genocide Memorial. We have a 7 days long also genocide prevention program with the youth from the region of Western Balkans. We are bringing international and local experts, civil society, survivors, curators. We are combining art and this special experience where young people can spend 7 days in the city, which is now going through post-genocidal reconstruction. They can definitely see that, you know, after genocide is done, that there is a second struggle, which is actually economical struggle and the destroyed infrastructure and, you know, the problem of returnees and all these process which is coming after you have genocide. And that is really important for youth to be able to actually, you know, spend some time and speak with ordinary people, speak with the young people from that community, see how they are dealing with the past. And for us, we are always, you know, putting in a focus prevention as a part of every single program we do. Unfortunately, in 2000, after 10 years after genocide, we didn't have a lot of understanding by the international community when we were urging for genocide prevention. Previously, and if I would mention that we do work in the field of genocide prevention, the donors would just say like, oh, those are, you know, old-fashioned topics from the 90s, move on, not understanding that dealing with the past is a long process, that it takes time. And we did combine in our work the experiences of Holocaust, experiences from Rwanda, Cambodia, and our approach is always global. And that is something maybe what can also work. When young people are exposed to some other conflict, some other story, they can reconnect from their own experience and learn and see how these unfortunately horrific crimes are happening through all around the world, and that we all together have to work, you know, to prevent.
Thank you for that. We are close to, we are in the last 5 minutes of this conversation. As concluding remarks, you are both, we have a scholar, we have someone who is a journalist, and someone who has spent the last 20 years trying to think through how to educate and think through our societies. What message do you have for many of us from India and other places where we're dealing with not only the crisis of violence, but also people are seriously worrying about what mass violence might happen in the next few months and weeks? We would love to have your concluding remarks.
I'll let Velma go first.
Thank you so much. I mean, what I can say from the experience of Western Balkans, and unfortunately from my country, which is even now dealing with so many complicated consequences of genocide and mass violence which took place in the 90s, is that it takes a lot of time in post-conflict reconstruction actually to rebuild a country, and especially young people, they need to be aware that the keeping peace is responsibility of all of us, and especially of youth, and that they should cherish, and that they should definitely be aware that war is not just what they saw on the television or what they heard, or the mass violence in any way, or it's much more. It really does change your life forever. It really does change a lot of destinies, and it does affect generations. So what I can definitely send as a message is to media and academic community and the politicians and the youth and the general public, is that we are all can contribute, and we are part of larger community. We are, it's a global community. We are citizens of the world, and we all holding responsibility. The families especially, because the families are where, you are learning about the values, and you're learning about what is good and what is right. The families can also contribute by spreading the message of love and peace and interreligious dialogue instead of language of hatred. So I'm kind of urging on all of us to, preserve the peace and together work on prevention.
I agree entirely with Velma. I think that's a wonderful way to end. I will just add that, in terms of India, I do think we need, and this is something that Gregory Stanton and Genocide Watch has made the call for, but we need a global sort of focus on India in the next months, and sort of a rallying of all of our international and then domestic in India resources towards genocide prevention, and it should be called that. So we have to, I think the most important thing we can do is put impending genocide, looming genocide on the table as a term, right? And have everyone in civil society everywhere in the world, but particularly in India, think about how the work they're doing can pivot towards genocide prevention, so that Muslims in India are not left alone. So it is clear that they are protected by many, many layers of internal and external forces of protection. And so that perhaps those who may be planning something feel pressure to pull back. So I think we all need to really focus on India.
Thank you so much. And this brings us to the end of day 2. Over the past 2 days, we've had some remarkable scholars, thinkers, activists speak about what it means to think about genocide. But also today marks 20 years of the Gujarat pogrom, which also created some of the biggest ripples within the Indian democratic fabric. Tomorrow is the 3rd day of the conference, which is the way forward preventing genocide. We have some incredible speakers lined up tomorrow, and I hope many of you who tuned in today not only engage with the remarkable work that Velma and Elisa do, but also make time for the conference tomorrow. Once again, thank you so much, and it's been a privilege and a pleasure to be in conversation with both of you.
Thank you all very much.